Anastasia, The Ringing Cedars is the first in a series of 10 books which sold over 10 million copies in Russia and has been translated into 20 languages. These books have spawned a movement called Anastasianism, or Ringing Cedars, which has thousands, if not millions, of adherents in Russia and in Eastern Europe, and starting to spread into America, Canada, and Western Europe as well. And these adherents are kind of gathered in so-called kinship settlements, so kind of small communes, getting back to small-scale growing your own crops kind of thing. And this whole movement is based on the teachings of the eponymous character of these books, Anastasia, who is this sort of demi-goddess-y kind of woman who lives in the taiga, the tundra forests of Siberia, and it's her teachings that are at the center of this book. So we're going to be exploring the story of the book in this episode and the themes of the conversations that her and the author Vladmir Megre have in the course of the book, and just be doing a bit of analysis of some of the parts of the book that I find particularly fascinating. So the story of the book is quite simple. It's an autobiographical account by the author, who is an entrepreneur, and in spring of 1994 he chartered a number of vessels to go up the river Ob. So from Novosibirsk, I think is the city near the borders of Kazakhstan, where the river Ob kind of begins, and 3,500 kilometers all the way up to another town called Salakard in the Arctic Circle and back. And on this return journey from Salakard, Megre stops at this little village, and he's approached by these two old men who are trying to get him to chop down this cedar tree that is off in the forest. And apparently this cedar tree is ringing, and the wood of this tree has magical properties. And one of the old guys shows his pendant, this pendant he wears of cedar, which is all these magical different colors, and he says that the properties of the ringing cedar have the ability to heal people of diseases. And the author asks even AIDS, because I guess this is the early 90s, so that was the big disease back then. It would be coronavirus now, I guess. He says even AIDS, and the guy goes, yeah, of course. Once Megre has explained to him what it is, so Megre kind of thinks, that's all nonsense. He's skeptical, and he leaves anyway, continues on the journey. But then he falls sick whenever he returns to Moscow, and he kind of, it's the memory of the trip that burns in him, and he keeps thinking about this, and he decides to use this time in hospital to start researching the properties of cedar. So he goes down this rabbit hole, and he quotes a lot of biblical references and historical references to cedars, as well as looking in scientific literature for what are the healing properties of cedars, to see if there's any value to what these old fellas are saying. And then he decides to make another trip, and this time just taking his headquarters ship. He goes on another journey up the river Ob and returns to that place. He returns to that village where he met the two old guys, and disembarks alone, and is going to go ask local villagers about the two old guys and where they would be, when he runs into this woman, and she reveals herself to be Anastasia, and she says that she is the granddaughter and the great-granddaughter of these two old men, and that she will take him to the cedar. And he's already a little bit creeped out because she already knows his name. So they go off anyway, and it's 25 kilometers to the cedar from the village. And once they come to the tundra forest, Anastasia takes off all of her clothes, stuffs them in a trunk. Apparently she needs no clothes, she's immune to the cold. And yeah, that's kind of the beginning of the revelation of who Anastasia really is. And the rest of the book is an account of 3 days of conversations and interactions between them once he has gone to the forest with her. So it's his initial intention to chop down the cedar tree, but she's now decided that that's not the wisest thing. We don't see the grandfather, great-grandfather again, and it all centers around the interactions between the author, Vladimir Megre, and this woman of the tundra, Anastasia. And we learn that she is no ordinary woman. She has all these amazing abilities, from telepathy to the ability to commune with animals and nature. All seems to be in a sort of harmonious relationship with her. She doesn't have to worry about food because squirrels bring her cedar nuts, or there's plenty of berries around. She is immune to the cold, so she just sleeps out, and she has no house or kettle or anything like that. She just sleeps out in the middle of the forest. And after a rocky first night where Vladimir woke up to the realization that he'd been using a bear as a pillow, but of course it was totally safe because Anastasia had tamed, the bear was tame and she patted it on the head when it came out in the morning. But the second night he requests that she sleep beside him, and he's become immune to her nudity by this point after a very strange interaction at first, which we'll go into later. But as he's going to sleep, he begins to think about having a son and how he always wanted a son, and then one thing leads to another and they end up having sex. But of course it's a completely different type of sex to what he's ever had before, because it's just completely different because it's with Anastasia and the emotional undercurrent of it, I guess. And the two have many conversations over these 3 days. Many a time Vladimir turns into be like a really moody, impetuous kind of person because of things that she says or does, and ultimately she uses her special abilities to form this sort of plan of which Vladimir is going to be the mouthpiece. So he's going to write a book which conveys her message to the world, which will lead to a transformation of the world. He's going to write the books, and the books are going to lead to this other thing, and then there's going to be a movie, and there's going to be this whole movement around it, and it's going to be this transformation of Russian culture, I guess in particular, but world culture as a whole. Vladimir will of course make a lot of money in the process, and he will lead people away from the dark ways of technocracy, which is what she calls our modern artificial civilization, and lead them towards a sort of small-scale self-sufficient agriculture. And this is kind of the state of events. Vladimir's just leaving on the last page of the book. He's just departing from the forest and is about to head back into the world. And there's a lot of extra stuff at the end of like letters to the author, and the author is kind of a recount of what happened afterwards. But obviously there's another 9 books that come afterwards which go into more detail and to tell more about what's happened since then. But yeah, that's essentially the story of it. So really the meat of the book is in the conversations that they have and the themes that they cover. So before we explore the topics that they talked about in the book, there's a couple of points that are worth keeping in mind. The first is at the personal psychological level. So at the time that this book is happening to Megre, so we're talking spring 1994, he is 44 at this point, and that means he's just after that midlife transition that Jung talks about. So Jung places it between 38 and 42, and he says this is the time of like the second adolescence, and obviously it varies in the same way that adolescence can vary, but it's around this age that people enter into that midlife transition and something different awakens in them, whether there's some kind of a shift in the psyche that happens there. So you can think of Jung's psychotic episodes that culminated in the Red Book, and which he said the rest of his work was just a reflection on this time period. So that was between his ages of 38 and 41. There's Muhammad, who started having the Quran revealed to him at the age of 40. There's Nietzsche, for whom thus spoke Zarathustra, which he would have considered his masterpiece, that kind of flowed through him. That inspiration occurred for him at the age of 39 to 41 was when that came through him. You got Moby Dick, which was written by Herman Melville at the age of 42. Khalil Gibran was 40 when he wrote The Prophet. Paulo Coelho was 41 when he wrote The Alchemist. The author James Redfield, who wrote The Celestine Prophecy, it took him 2.5 years to write it, and I think that was from age 41 to 43 or 40 to 43. And finally you have Carlos Castaneda, who was 43 when he wrote the first in the series of Don Juan books, the teachings of Don Juan. So he was 43 when that happened. So you can see this is a significant kind of age, and it's the time when this sort of book tends to be written by people. It's something around that age of transformation, of the collective unconscious awakening in someone seems to happen at that midlife point. And so we can see this. It's not unexpected to see that Megre would write this book at this point in his life. Another point to keep in mind is the broader culture. So this is 1994, 1995. This is only, 1991 was when the Soviet Union collapsed. And that's obviously very important for a number of reasons. One is that you've got the collapse of order. So before this, Russia, or the Soviet Union, was the leading superpower in the world with the US. These were the two loggerheads in the Cold War. So it was a technologically advanced and extremely powerful state. And in 1991 this collapsed, and in the opening up of the Soviet Union into a capitalist kind of a market economy, all of the wealth more or less got hoovered up by these Russian oligarchs who became incredible billionaires. They became incredibly and untouchably wealthy, while most people remained entirely poor. So you saw the immediate stratification of society into extremely rich and extremely poor, and this happened through corruption and through a lot of kind of dodgy dealings. So you can see this inequality forming, as well as just the order, the sense of order that had lasted for how many decades just destroyed, and so you find that you got an entire country and an entire block of countries that are just in treading water now. Of course, the other reason why it's significant is because the Soviet Union was officially an atheist state and had little tolerance for religions. And so you had from 1916 up to 1991, you had no religion. All religions were underground in the Soviet Union, and that's obviously very significant. You might think of the enantiodromia of the opposite emerging from the original thing, so the thesis becoming the antithesis, and hence we have the formation of all these new religions in Russia after a period of atheism. So I think there's maybe something going on there, but definitely you can see maybe a reason. There was a thirst, a hunger in the Russian psyche for religions, for some kind of meaning, and that comes out of not just the collapse of order, but also perhaps, especially in this case, the fact that it was a previously atheistic state, so there was no religion really to immediately grapple onto that people would have been as accustomed to. Obviously, the Orthodox tradition, long-standing in Russian, is the biggest religion there, but because it wasn't as prominent, it wasn't practiced the whole way through that Soviet period, it was like a re-emergence for that as well. So this all goes some way to explaining the influence of the Anastasia series and why these books went on to sell over 10 million copies at this time. You can see the psychological undercurrents, both in where Megre's inspiration could have come from, the bubbling up from the collective unconscious, and then the cultural conditions which perhaps created a fertile ground for this sort of message to arrive. So it's led, as I mentioned in introduction, to a movement called Anastasianism or Anastasianism. In the book, Megre emphasizes that the pronunciation is Anastasia, whereas I would be normally calling it Anastasia. But anyway, so Anastasianism, and there's a Wikipedia page on this, and here's what they have to say. Anastasianism, or the Ringing Cedars, is a new religious movement, often classified as New Age, that started in central Russia in 1997 and has since spread across the world. Ringing Cedars Anastasians are sometimes characterized by scholars as Radnovery, Slavic neo-paganism, and often as a modern pagan movement of their own. The Anastasian movement has become one of the most successful new religious movements in Russia, and from there it has spread to other Slavic countries, broader Eastern Europe, and communities have also been established in the West. So what I see here is a man who has entered a major transition in the middle of his life, and I see a country that has kind of done the same. To my mind, it's comparable to the story of the foundation of Islam. If you look at Muhammad as a merchant in the city of Mecca, and Mecca had become very rich in the century before this, and then you have Muhammad at age 40 getting these revelations, and these revelations are about bringing greater equality, increasing the virtue of charity in society, and this is speaking to a civilization, to a city that has become greatly unequal. The Quraysh tribe had become extremely wealthy, and there was a lot of people who were poor and disaffected, and there wasn't much room for the youth to level that playing field. So you could see this as a society that's entered middle age, and we kind of covered a lot of that in the Spiral Dynamics episode on the foundation of Islam. But this is really that transition point again between the Spiral Dynamics orange, the capitalism, into the green, which is more about equality. And we see this happening in our own culture today as well, with the social justice movements and the Occupy Wall Street. The beginning of equality is beginning to tip a little bit too high, and so you see the emergence of this other archetypal meme that wants to level that out and wants to balance the playing fields a bit. And it's interesting to look at the parallels there, that Muhammad was an inherent part of the system there. He was a merchant in Mecca at the time, and Megre is an entrepreneur, so he's part of this technocratic money-making machine of the orange phase. And so it's a natural thing for them both to evolve into green. That's the next stage in their evolution, but also they're part of that pre-existing society. So really interesting to see that map over, and it looks like the cocktail of great inequality and this man who's part of the system, who reaches middle age and has some sort of a spiritual event happening to him, that this is a cocktail for the formation of a new religion. So very interesting stuff. This is kind of the backdrop to Anastasianism. So let's dive in now and have a look at what they actually talk about in the book and what the topics are that Anastasia is actually preaching to Vladimir Megre. Okay, so what does the book actually say? What are the conversations that these two have over the course of the 3 days? Well, For Anastasia, there are two core topics that she's mad about, and that is child rearing and the Dachniks. And the Dachniks are the people who live on dachas. They're people who live on plots of land where they're more or less self-sufficient, where they know every plant in their garden, they know every crop intimately, like the individual thing. So they're keeping a close eye on everything that they grow, and they have a relationship with nature. They have a relationship with their own plot of land. So her dream is that people will leave behind the artificial society of technocracy that we live in modern civilization, and that they will come back to these kind of dachas, come to these self-sufficient homesteads. From her perspective, this isn't just a return to tribal living, but this is the way of real progress, and that comes from a few views on human nature that she has, which we'll be exploring. So a lot of the conversations in the book revolve around the true potentialities of humanity. Anastasia is held up as the counter ideal to the technocratic ideal. So in the brilliance of her mind and the simplicity of her lifestyle and the richness of her lifestyle, this is the counter ideal which we are to follow instead of the kind of a technocratic, civilized approach. So it's the whole thing of getting back to nature, becoming in alignment and in harmony with nature rather than separate from it in this technocratic society. And I guess a core thing to understanding the idea of progress in this nature thing rather than just being a return to tribal living is understanding Anastasia's outlook on humanity and the importance of humanity. So you can see a bit of a Christian undertone. There's a Christian undertone that runs through a lot of the work, and I think that's not explicitly, if anything, there's an explicit distaste for Christianity, for organized religion, but you can see the influence of Christian thinking, of certain ideas of good versus evil and simple virtues, and the biblical emphasis on the importance of man. So there are many kind of Christian themes which I think would resonate with, and I think even one of the letters at the end, someone says that it's a Christian message even though it's not explicitly Christian. So I think that's part of the reason why it could grow on the fertile ground of the Russian psyche. But yeah, so for Anastasia, humanity are very, very important. They're of central importance in the entirety of creation, which is not just Earth, but is the entire universe. And humans have a central role to play in this. We're so much more important than anything else out there. In one of the most bizarre chapters in the book, Anastasia talks about flying saucers and how a flying saucer had come down, and so Megre is like, well, of course they're so much more intelligent than us. They must be so much better than us. To which Anastasia replies, not at all. They have a long way to go to attain the level of man. They are afraid of us, afraid to approach people, even though they are very curious. At first they were afraid of me. They trained their mental paralyzers on me, put on quite a show. They tried to frighten me, shock me. It was quite a challenge to calm them down and convince them I would only treat them with affection. Well, how can they be less smart than us if they can do things man can't do yet? What is so surprising about that? Bees too make incredible structures out of natural materials, including whole ventilation and heating systems. But that does not mean they are superior to man in intelligence. In the universe, there is no one and nothing stronger than man except God. So you can see a whole heap of Anastasia's values just in that thing, her whole worldview. You can kind of see there that not being impressed with even the greatest technologies, and this prioritizing more the harmony with nature, but also seeing that central role of man, not just on Earth, but in the universe. We're not just like an evolutionary creature that accidentally happened to show up. We are so central to the entire workings of the universe, and you see this in a few other places throughout the book. In the whole of the universe, there is no being capable of more powerful development and greater freedom than man. All other civilizations bow before man. All sorts of civilizations have the capacity of developing and bringing themselves to perfection, but only in one direction, and they are not free. Even the greatness of man is beyond their grasp. God, the great mind, created man, and to no one else gave he more than to man. So you can see there not just the importance of man and the importance of us within the universe, but that there are more important things than technology, that she's not impressed even with the aliens who can travel from planet to planet, that man's potential is somehow greater than that. And so a lot of the conversations that they have are about the potentials of man and the true powers and the true potentialities that are in the human condition and that we see her living out of, and certain powers that she has. So it's worth exploring a few of those different powers and different abilities that she has, because this is almost like the carrot that is dangled in front of us. If you want to follow the Anastasian path rather than the traditional technocratic path, then you want to see where the end goal goes. What's more appealing about that? What is the end point of that? And it's not simply a return to nature, as I've said. It's not just that we'd be happier. It's this thing of like, we'll be both happier and more powerful. We will have more progress and we will also be spiritually more evolved. So it's this almost having your cake and eating it too. It's really appealing kind of vision. So the first kind of power of hers that we run into is her immunity to cold. So once they get to the forest, she stuffed those clothes in the trunk of the tree, and she's wandering around naked then. And immediately, quite soon after, we see the second one of her powers, because Megre is like, well, what's she doing? How can she? He asks her, how is she not afraid? Why is she not afraid of being attacked, of being raped, of being murdered out here in the wild? And he grabs her with the implication, I guess, that he's going to rape her. And he's immediately struck down by nature. He's immediately knocked out. And when he comes to, she is smiling and she's waving her hands, pushing things back. And he assumes, he's like, well, wow, oh, you did that. You knocked me out. You got some powers. But it's actually nature itself that is in harmony with her knocked him out. And she's smiling and pushing it back in order to reassure nature that he's no harm, that they were just playing or something. And so this harmony with nature is actually able to attack him. And that's another one of her abilities, is that she is protected by nature, so she doesn't need to worry about violence. But that's not even the end of her communion with nature. There's also, she doesn't spare a thought for food, we're told many times in the book. And at one point we see a squirrel come up to her and he puts a cedar nut in her mouth, so she's just getting fed here. She doesn't have to give a thought for food. And she says this is because of the purity of her thoughts. And she says if the people, the Dachniks, over time, they will be learning these secrets from the plants. They will be cultivating this way of being, and eventually they will grow into a civilization of Anastasias with this communion and these powers of nature. In another chapter, we see that everything in nature resonates with her and resonates with her heartbeat, like everything is in attunement with her. And this isn't Anastasia aligning herself with nature, but it's, again, this central importance of man. It's the other way around, and we find this being emphasized quite a few times. Man can control everything. Man is designed to control everything. Everything but everything on earth, every blade of grass, every insect has been created for man. And everything has its individual appointed task to perform in the service of man. And so this extends to all the animals, to all the trees. Everything is in alignment with her heartbeat. And when she aligns it with Megre, at one point he feels an incredible amount of joy of this harmony and this, I guess, the power feeling that goes with it as well. And it doesn't stop with that sort of a harmonious feeling. It's a tameness. So when the bear comes out of the cave after being Megre's pillow, she pats it on the head and it goes off. And later she dances with a bear while a wolf watches, and the wolf is wanting to protect her, and every animal craves her attention. And so it's such an anthropocentric perspective. It's so centered on the importance of humanity. And this connection even extends to the planets above, and we're told that she feels in harmony with the planets, that she receives information from them, and that the sun gets its brightness. I think that it's just from the reflection of human positive feelings, like our positive feelings go up and are reflected back down to us in the sun, whereas our dark feelings go down into the earth. So this entire universe is very much human-centered. Which is not really something you get many other places. So it's quite an interesting perspective. And so she doesn't need clothes, she doesn't need to worry about food, and she is completely immune to disease. But that's almost just the beginning. That's almost like the noble savage archetype of just being more in communion with nature, and that being our natural state, and being happier in that state. So we normally find this with the idolization of tribal living, but we find that with her, she apparently also has the mind of a supercomputer. So at one point Megre gives her the kind of a challenge to come up with some business plan or something like that. He asked her to come up with this plan for reducing air pollution in cities, and she lies down and opens up to this information, and she comes back an hour later and she's like, okay, so if you do this, she comes up with some filter that you put on the front of a car, and she says, okay, if you do this and you do this for this long, and she's not just calculated the invention but also all of the other people involved, the psychological factors involved. And at some point Megre just he realizes that she's done millions of calculations and she's got a more advanced mind than any of our computers on earth. She's like a supercomputer, and he says this to her, and she's pretty unimpressed by it. She just kind of writes it off as a normal ability, really. But that's not very interesting, she replied, adding, that is primitive and somewhat degrading. Competing with a computer, that is tantamount to, oh, how can I find a good analogy? That is tantamount to hands or feet competing with a prosthesis. And not even with a full prosthesis, but just a part of one. With the computer, the most vital element is missing, and that most vital element is feelings. As well as this, she explains how to build a flying saucer in the flying saucer chapter. She explains, here's how I do it, and but you'd need maybe 10 people to do it. So it's this idea that humans have much more capacity, that we're working off an extremely degraded level of potential because, and in her case, she says it's because of technocracy and because of our educational system. And I'm not sure, does she mention at some point why tribes before technocracy wouldn't have been like that, but I think it's because of the purity of thought. I think she mentions at some point that you need to have a purity of thought and not be worrying about things like food. So it's kind of this pointing to these amazing potentials of the human organism, and this idea that humans have minds that are much more powerful than supercomputers. And she's got one final ability, which is kind of her central ability in the book, and it's there's a lot of chapters in which she uses this, and it's what she calls the ray, and this is her telepathic ability, so she can see into the lives of other people. So at one point they look to see what his wife is doing, another point they check in with Dachniks, and other point they check in on entrepreneurs. So she's able to see into the lives of these different people, and she's able to plant thoughts, plant seeds, and to send a sort of positive emotion. And of course she says that the fueling mechanism behind this telepathic ray is positive feelings, is purity of thought and purity of intention. So understanding this communion of nature with Anastasia and this privileged place of humanity in nature kind of helps us to understand what her dream is. And her dream is the combination of different child rearing techniques and also of these Dachniks, and these things kind of go together. It's the re-education of man, I guess. So the Dachniks is the beginning to cultivate that harmony with nature, and that beginning to harmonize with the earth, and to know all the separate plants in the garden, and to begin to get their information, and to be closer to the stars, and to do away with the artificial things, and to raise children in this way. So the divine child archetype really bleeds through a lot of this book, and we see how children are these perfect creatures, these angels, and you kind of see that a lot in spiritual literature, this idolization of the child, and how children are so perfect, and it's only nature that corrupts them. Man is born free but lives everywhere in chains. And so the idea of the Dachniks is that this is the path to her. This is the path to humans becoming like Anastasia. And it's getting back to that self-sufficient farming. It's getting to living in communion with the land. And there's one other final part of the philosophy of her worldview, and that's the thing that keeps us in technocracy, the thing that grounds us in the mud, and that is the dark forces. So there are light forces and there are dark forces, it seems, but the dark forces are very prominent, and they're the things that keep us locked into technocracy. And this is a metaphysical force. These are non-human but very real energetic forces which try and keep us, and they pen us into the kind of classic Christian things that are looked down on, the sinful carnal desires and the artificial living and the negative emotions of anger and negative emotions towards our peers. So it's, again, you can see that kind of Christian undertone coming through there, that good versus evil kind of worldview. And Anastasia is the positive counter ideal. So she's like the Christ of this story. And she does talk about how women are the ones that have the power to change it. So in previous episodes, I've explored how in Rome and in the present we look to the East for importing exotic religions, and we're looking to have a new inspiration. But the thing that I pointed out was the difference between the Romans importing Christianity and Isis and Mithras cults versus us importing Taoism, Hinduism, Buddhism, is that Taoism, Hindu, Buddhism are just as old as Christianity. They're already ancient religions. So what's interesting with Anastasianism is to see what will a new religion look like, what would a new emergence of a collective unconscious on the fertile soil look like. And it's interesting to see that the role of women has shifted here, and that there's room for it's a feminine transformation. So that's something that I found quite fascinating with him, to see that Anastasia is the ideal, and she says that women are the ones that can change the world. Yeah, that's kind of the essence of Anastasia's philosophy in the Ringing Cedars. She preaches about the evils of technocracy and the potentials of man to become not just happy in harmony with nature, but also incredibly powerful spiritually and materially. And what I find so fascinating, like approaching the book, is that this is essentially the Jungian Anima. This is the soul image speaking. This is very much an archetype speaking. So in the Nietzsche episode, we talked about how that was the Dionysus speaking through Nietzsche. Well, this is very much, we can see this is the Anima, the soul image of Vladimir Megre speaking. And as we've been exploring in the psychology of Kundalini Yoga and the psychology of the chakras, the journey of personal transformation only begins when you have those basic needs met. And so what's interesting is with Anastasia and with what she's talking about is she says she doesn't have to worry about food. She doesn't have to worry about violence. She doesn't have to worry about clothes or shelter. So she's got, it's like all of her basic needs are met. And she says that humans spend too much time thinking about these things. But of course, if you've ever tried meditating, if you've ever tried fasting, you'll know that these desires, these drives don't just disappear. They don't disappear just because you try and control your thoughts. And anyone who I guess who's tried positive thinking as well will be able to testify to the same, that the mind doesn't get controlled that easily. And so in the psychology of Svadhisthana, we kind of talked about how there's two ways of solving the problem. You can either renounce the worldly and become a monk, and you can set off and you can kind of burn your bridge behind you with those drives, or else you can resolve them, you can go through them, you can achieve a solid foundation, at which point the Kundalini will awaken, at which point the transformation begins, because you no longer have to think about food, you no longer have to think about clothing, you no longer have to think about status or esteem. All of those things are kind of covered. So you've got that base, you've reached a certain pinnacle in terms of Muladhara, in terms of the earthly life, at which point you can start to think about spiritual things. Whereas with Anastasia, we see, this spiritual thing is all that there is. If you stop thinking about these lower drives, then all of a sudden this higher thing will open up, and this is where humans are meant to live. So it's almost like Kundalini speaking in some way. It's talking about the transformation, but it's kind of skewing the story because it's not thinking about the completeness of the human organism. It's saying that from childhood you can become that, but I think that psychologically it's a bit missing. And I guess that's the way around that is she says that, you can't just become like her. I don't know why you couldn't just become like her. I don't know why her people, her father, her grandfather, her great-grandfather, why they couldn't have just raised more humans in that way, or why people can't be raised in that way. But instead we have to take this long path through Dachniks, and generations later we'll have that information. So it's psychologically unconvincing from that point of view when you look at it as an immediate transformation. But of course she sets up this whole Dachnik thing as an intermediate thing. And I guess the Dachnik is an idea that it's supposed to cover those basic needs quicker so that you can get to the spiritual quicker, rather than getting locked in by the dark forces, which would be, I guess, the temptation that pens us into the chasing our tail in a capitalist thing, the kind of a rat race. So you're running around chasing the same things, always looking to get the cheese, and you're kind of chasing your own tail. So getting locked into a vicious cycle maybe is more likely to happen in a technocratic society, whereas we want to get to these spiritual realities, get to the higher potentialities of humanity. So it might map over quite well with the psychology of Kundalini Yoga there, and I think that there is something. There's a lot of value to what she's saying if seen in that context, and if you see her as the Anima, if you see her as almost a voice of Kundalini in some way, of a Shakti energy speaking. And even if you're thinking of this as a traditional narrative of individuation from a Jungian perspective, the fact that Megre has sex with her and that they have a son together, they have a child together, that's even the traditional pattern of the alchemical transformation. So even the meeting the Anima, and then the child being born, and this is the self, this is the new world. So the whole thing as a psychodrama makes perfect sense. It reads perfectly well there. For me, it doesn't read so well from a literal point of view, and this is where I begin to have some hang-ups about the book. I talked in a previous episode on the story of the disabled fox, and I talked about the way of the peaceful warrior and books like that with Celestine Prophecy and all that. There's this kind of a sense of, you draw the line, you know where reality ends and where it doesn't, and what that does is it's the people on the more cynical end of the spectrum will disregard it entirely, and the people on the naive end of the spectrum, the more open end of the spectrum, will just swallow it hook, line and sink. And so the author can kind of say, well, I'm not out to mislead anyone, you draw the line wherever you want yourself. It's partly fictional, partly factional. In the case of Megre, though, he does something different. I mean, in those books, there's still an admittance that some part of it is fiction, whereas Megre, he's saying that this is completely true, and he plants seeds of this throughout the book, and it's very much in line with that thing in the Gospels of blessed are those who do not see but believe. And it's a bit of a frustrating thing. I guess that's how Christianity formed as well, as by esteeming the belief, by esteeming faith rather than experience and rather than actual truth. It's a way for people to buy into it, I guess. But Megre he feeds this in one letter a little girl has written to him that he shares, and at the end of the book she wrote to him saying that nobody else around believes that it's true, but I believe that it's true. I believe that it happened. And he gives her a long and detailed response. But there's one passage in particular that I found quite interesting. Nastia. Judging by your reaction to the book, you seem to be already healthier spiritually than a lot of people, and that's the main thing. I'm beginning to realize that that's really the case. As far as whether people around you believe or don't believe in Anastasia's existence, I'll answer you by quoting what someone said at one of my get-togethers with readers. When that question was put to me for the umpteenth time, he got up and declared in a loud voice, "Look, people, you're holding in your hands an impulse of inspiration, a thought bursting forth, a call to action, an idea. It's right there in your hands. What more do you want? A sample of her blood, urine, and feces for analysis? Is there no way you can do without that? After all, the greatest and most important proof is already sitting right there in your hands." Or in another scene later, when he's talking about an investigation he did to corroborate some facts Anastasia stated about some old tombs in Russia, he says, "It took me pretty much half a year to collect historical data and trek through the Caucasus Mountains to see the dolmens with my own eyes and take pictures of them. I was, finally, convinced. But at the end of the day, it turns out that if I'd simply believed right off, I could have used this half year to a greater advantage. It turns out that a great deal depends on one's ability to believe." And so Megre feeds the inclinations of people, the leanings they have towards believing that this is 100% true. And on one of the American branches of this movement, there was a thing for skeptics, and one of the things was about this court case that went on in 2001. This woman tried to write this sequel to the Anastasia books, and Megre took her to court, and in the court Megre admitted that Anastasia was a creation of his mind. Now the spin that the website puts on this is that he had to do that in order to protect the intellectual rights to Anastasia, whereas he hasn't lied the other 20 years. So what we have is the man who only lied under oath, but in the other 2 decades has not lied. And so yeah, I mean, cynics will read that one way and the believers will read it another way, but for me it's very far from being literally true now. I think it has a lot of value on a psychological level, but even at that, you see a man, you see Vladimir Megre, who is an entrepreneur who was almost bankrupt by his own account at this time, and who sets out to create his own cedar oil business. And he goes off, he writes this book, self-publishes, sells it on the street, and writes another 9 books afterwards, and has his own cedar oil business, has a massive online shop where they sell these cedar oils, they sell the cedar perfumes and elixir and the cedar pendants. And so it's a very, very successful business model. And so it looks like, from that perspective, yeah, it kind of I think there's a lot of value in the book as it is. There's a lot of value in the book as a psychological exegesis, as a psychological journey into the spiritual realms. But then for me, it's just it just speaks to that genre of spiritual books that kind of take advantage of people's willingness to believe, of people's search for meaning. So maybe I'm wrong, maybe it's 100% true. I don't see why a flying saucer would specifically land in the tundra, why she's the only person on Earth who has met aliens and talked about it. And yeah, it's just, I mean, yeah, people could make the same argument with the Celestine Prophecy, with the Alchemist, with the Way of the Peaceful Warrior, and it's a common trick in spiritual circles, except normally it's not as explicit as it is in this story. And I guess it's his doubling down on it, it's his claim that it's 100% factual that has led in part to its becoming a religious movement. It's not just the fertile ground outside, but it's his determined testimony that it is 100% true. Even it's different, I would say, with Muhammad. Like Muhammad, I can see how Muhammad would believe it. I don't think there's anything disingenuous about convincing it, and about him talking about the revelation of the Quran. But if Megre didn't have these experiences in the Arctic Circle, then there's no way around it. He's a complete bullshitter. He's selling people a lie, and you could say, yeah, it's having a wonderful effect on people's lives, but if he's lying, it's different. And that kind of hurts my soul a little bit, because I think the text stands by itself, that there's something of value here. This is clearly a spiritual journey that this guy has been on, and it makes perfect sense as a work of active imagination. And I think it still stands as that, but yeah, it's just the idea of this entrepreneur who's making a lot of money out of it at the same time, and it's all too convenient in some sense that that's kind of a bit of a drawback for me from the book. But in general, very interesting book, and it's so fascinating. It's really fed my imagination to see it in the context of this movement that's growing around it, and to see it in comparison to Christianity and how that took off in Rome. So it's really kind of given me fueled a lot of interesting thoughts. So that's just about everything that I wanted to cover. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, please subscribe if you haven't already. And if you have any comments, thoughts, or feedback, I'd love to hear from you down in the comments. And otherwise, I shall see you next time. Thank you for watching.